Box Blur is a relatively new addition to the Blur and Sharpen toolkit in After Effects. It basically allows you to decide how high of a quality is the blur. Is it very rough and boxy looking, or is it very, very smooth to the point where you can just atomize layers and text into thin air? It's one of my favorite effects because you can fine-tune how it looks. Let's play around with it for a minute. Here I have a stylized image of an eye. I'm going to select it and apply Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Box Blur. The default is one iteration, which is the coarsest setting. As I increase the blur radius, you'll notice that the pattern is indeed very boxy. You particularly see it here on the edges of the image. As I back it off a little bit, you see some interesting chunkiness going on in the eyebrow. In some ways, this is kind of an interesting blur all on its own right. If you want a smooth blur, it's a bit coarse though. So if you want a smoother blur, just increase the iterations. Once you get into the realm of around 3 iterations or 4 iterations, you're right in the realm of what fast blur or Gaussian blur looks like, a nice, smooth blur. One other thing I like about box blur is you can keep cranking up those iterations. And the more you crank it up, the softer and puffier and more blended the image becomes. You can keep going and going and going until the image starts to become partially transparent. I'll turn on the transparency grid, and you can see just how much of the background is coming through the image at this point. This is a great effect if you want to do things like make something appear out of thin air or appear to atomize, because the layer gets really transparent without you having to animate the transparency setting. Now speaking of animation, there's a few things you can animate nicely and a few things you can't. I'm going to set the blur radius to 20, start with one iteration, keyframe it, go to the end of my comp, and go up to something like, say, 10 iterations. Iterations can only go in whole numbers, so when I animate it, you'll see I get a very stepped appearance to this image. Iterations does not animate smoothly. You can't smoothly go from atomized to a very boxy look. On the other hand, the blur radius does animate smoothly. So if I move this up to, say, 10 iterations, which is a nice soft blur, I'll go ahead and keyframe, coming from, say, 50 pixels down to 0 pixels. RAM preview. It'll take a little bit to calculate because higher iterations do take longer to calculate. But you see I have a really nice fade here from a very soft, blown out image, very indistinct, resolving to a very sharp eye. I'll go back to home, I'll turn off my animation, I'll go to something that looks a bit more reasonable here, like 20 and 3. Other than that, box blur does have your normal parameters such as blur dimensions, horizontal only or vertical only, and it does have repeat edge pixels just like fast blur does. Now just for comparison, let's check out box blur on text. I've got a second composition here with 2 very different types of fonts, a nice handwriting font and a very chunky font, just to see how box blur treats these different looking fonts. I'll select my layer and apply box blur. I'll go ahead and leave iterations at 1 for now, and as I increase the blur radius, you'll see I almost have a squinting sort of effect on my type. You'll see a few lines appear, and that's the boxiness again, the very small convolution kernel, to be technical, that box blur is using. As I crank up, it almost dissolves away into a nice line pattern, and I have used this effect in the past when I've wanted a little more of a high-tech or a little bit more of a grunge sort of look, as opposed to something very elegant. But as I start to increase the iterations, I start to get a very, very soft, cloudy look. When I really crank up the iterations, again, I can just disappear into a cloud of dust. Turn the transparency grid on, and the text is practically invisible. Go ahead and reduce the blur radius and resolve back to a nice clean text. So this is another fun effect to play with. Now I'm talking about how flexible this is, but let's go ahead and compare this to your normal fast and Gaussian blurs. I'll open my third comp, which has 4 instances of some text in it. Box blur with just 1 iteration, my very coarse, grungy, square sort of look. Box blur with 4 iterations, which is a very beautiful, smooth look. You see it's even more smooth than fast blur and Gaussian blur. And I've got the blur amount animating down from a high amount to a small amount. Calculate a RAM preview here. And now you see the animation of how box blur animates with low iterations or higher iterations and compared to your normal fast or Gaussian blurs. I mean, fast and Gaussian blurs do look good, but it's nice to have the flexibility that box blur offers. I'm trying to make a point of reaching for it more often in my toolkit rather than just going for fast blur, which is normally my default. And that's box blur. Don't let its name fool you, because usually when we say a blur has a boxy look, that's a derogatory statement. Box blur can look grungy and boxy, but can also look very smooth and elegant. Its name should be flexible blur, and you should get in the habit of trying to use it more often. You'll find it gives you more creative options.